What's going on, everybody? We're going to try to do a quick review of Chapter 7 of the Autobiography of Malcolm X as told to Alex Haley. Title of Chapter 7 is Hustler. Malcolm says that he can't remember all the hustles that he had during the next 2 years. This is after he stopped selling weed on the trains. He says that he kept a gun in the center of his back, and he was hanging out at the Grand Central Station. This is the time where he's after he was selling his Big Apple reefers. He says the police eventually tell him to leave, and he was blackballed from the railroad, so no longer able to sell sell weed on the trains. He was back hustling in the streets of Harlem. He says he considered himself a true hustler. He says, quote, a true hustler, uneducated, unskilled at anything honorable, and considered myself nervy and cunning enough to live by my wits, exploiting any prey that presented itself, end quote. He says the hustlers inevitably move into more and more worse and worse illegality and immorality. He says the competition forces restless behavior. He says, quote, if he ever slows down, the other hungry, restless foxes, ferrets, wolves, and vultures out there with him won't hesitate to make him their prey. Over the next 6 to 8 months, Malcolm did his first small robberies. He says that he would use cocaine to get pumped up for the robberies, and he talked about how he worked his way up from a 25 automatic to a 45, and he's talking about the size of the gun barrel. He says, quote, I saw when the eyes stared at the big black hole, the faces fell slack, and mouths sagged open, unquote. He says that he would stay high and move from room to room, so he's renting rooms. But he would move from room to room every week in the Sugar Hill section of Harlem. He was doing his robberies with Sammy the Pimp. He was still wearing. He talks about how he's still wearing the best suits, even though they were stolen. That's the suits that he was getting from the 40 Thieves gang. He made it a rule to, quote, never go after more than I needed to live on, end quote. So he was living somewhat modest in regards to finances. He would still play the numbers and call Sophia from Boston. His younger brother, Reginald, was able to come back to New York, and they talked about the family a lot. Reginald liked hanging around the musicians, and Malcolm was well known from when he sold weed. He says, quote, I was known to almost every popular Negro musician and around New York, end quote. This is in 1944, 1945. Malcolm is around 19 or 20 years old. Malcolm took Reginald all over Harlem. He got Reginald to meet Billie Holiday and Lionel Hampton, and he talks about how nice Lionel Hampton was, and he's obviously a big fan of Billie Holiday. Having Reginald around made Malcolm want to work more and get an apartment. He didn't want Reginald, quote, knocking around Harlem without anywhere to call home, end quote. He found an apartment next door to what he considered, what he called, quote, one of Harlem's most successful narcotics dealers, end quote. Malcolm talks about how he would school Reginald about Harlem and hustling. Malcolm felt that Reginald needed to get a hustle to make his own money. He helped Reginald to get a peddler's license, and Malcolm showed him where he could buy the discount clothes and sell them in the barbershops and the bars around town. Malcolm tried to hook his brother up with a white girl, but Reginald didn't like white women. Malcolm says, quote, I remember one time he met Sophia. He was so cool, it upset Sophia, and it tickled me, end quote. Reginald found an older black woman that was about 28 or 29 years old when Reginald's 16 years old. Malcolm says that, quote, Reginald was only 16, but a 6-footer, and he looked and acted much older than his years, end quote. The Savoy Ballroom talks about the Savoy Ballroom being closed during World War II by Mayor LaGuardia. He says that, quote, the real reason was to stop Negroes from dancing with white women, end quote. He briefly speaks about Adam Clayton Powell and some of his accomplishments. He mentions a riot in New York after a Negro got shot by cops at the Braddock Hotel, and how they destroyed the white establishments or white businesses. He says Wilt Chamberlain took over ownership of Small's Paradise. He talks about how it slowly becomes more difficult to make money in Harlem. He says, quote, some hustlers have been forced to go to work. Even some prostitutes had gotten jobs, end quote. Malcolm and Sammy became so desperate that they began to take what they considered to be impossible jobs. And he talks about an incident where Sammy is grazed by a bullet when they were splitting up to get away from one job. He talks about an incident where Sammy pulled a gun on Malcolm because Malcolm had put his hands on Sammy's girl. Malcolm was defending himself, and he put his hands on Sammy's girl, and Sammy pulled a gun on him. He said they eventually made up. They didn't fight or anything, but he says that things between him and Sammy were never the same. He says that Reginald became the only one that Malcolm could trust at this time. He talks about Reginald being lazy, and he quit his hustle. But Malcolm says that he was smart enough to take care of himself. Malcolm got back into running numbers, and he talks about how his boss's wife was a secretary for Dutch Schultz back in the 1930s. The name Dutch Schultz, he was involved in organized crime, and his name is synonymous with Lucky Luciano. After his boss's regarding his boss's wife, he says, quote, she knew from personal experience how crime existed only to the degree that law cooperated with it, end quote. And this is the time when Malcolm meets West Indian Archie, one of Harlem's, quote, really bad Negroes, end quote. He had done some time in Sing Sing before Malcolm came to Harlem. Archie was known for having a photographic memory, and he never had to write down anyone's numbers. He was a numbers runner, but he didn't have to write down numbers. He talks about how cops would never catch him with any evidence because he didn't write any numbers down, and he would have his own money. He wouldn't have to go anywhere else to pay you your winnings. He could pay you your winnings on the spot and then get the money from the establishment later. Malcolm started working for a madam to help clients find women. He said he would make over $100 a night doing what he called steering customers. He says the clients were, quote, rich men, middle-aged and beyond. The clients were, quote, rich men, middle-aged and well beyond. The clients were, quote, rich men, middle-aged and beyond. Men well past their prime. These weren't the college boys. These were their Ivy League fathers, end quote. And he talks about Harlem was their send-in. Malcolm says this world that he was working in at this time didn't care about black or white, only about money. He says, quote, just as long as they paid, end quote. He talks about some weird interactions between big black women and older white men. Malcolm says he talks about how the madam was making a small fortune off these old men. He talks about how this had an effect on how he viewed these men. He says, quote, so many of these men held responsible positions. They exercised guidance, influence, and authority over others, end quote. The white men only wanted black women. He says, quote, in all of my time in Harlem, I never saw a white prostitute touched by a white man, end quote. He also notes several white women were lesbians at this time. Malcolm would sell weed to the lesbians. Malcolm talks about how the madam got into business by hearing women complaining about men. She would hook them up with the Negro men she knew at her apartment. All her women wanted, quote, a black one or, quote, a real one. No brown, no red, only black men. The whites used the blacks sexually, and in turn, the blacks used the whites sexually. He talks about the low morals of some of the white men and how they agreed to allow their wives to be prostitutes. And he talks about a incident where a group of white men all put their keys in a hat, and whichever keys you would pull out, you would be able to sleep with that person's wife. But this was something, I guess, that they did. Talks about how Jews owned the property and blacks leased it. He says one day the madam's establishment gets robbed, and the manager hires hoodlums to go hunting for the robber. They thought Malcolm was the robber because the robber, well, they said that Malcolm looked like the robber. He was, quote, a light Negro wearing a hat, end quote. Malcolm takes a trip back to Michigan, and this is when Malcolm has to rinse his conch out in a toilet. It was the winter in Michigan, and the water pipes were frozen. When he goes back to New York, he didn't continue his steering job. He says he started to get sick a lot. He says, quote, he had colds all the time, end quote. He says he started smoking opium and smoking weed by the ounce. So weed by the ounce and a little bit of opium. He says he started working for a Jew named Jaime. Jaime made money by buying rundown restaurants, and Malcolm was getting paid $200 to $300 to transport bootleg liquor. He thinks that Jaime eventually got killed. He says, quote, I did hear that he was put in the ocean, and I knew he couldn't swim, end quote. Malcolm talks about an incident where he's in a phone booth in the fall of 1940. So Malcolm was in a phone booth in the fall of 1945 when Jackie Robinson got signed to the Brooklyn Dodgers. He says at this time he was getting $300 from hitting the. He said that he hit the numbers and he was getting $300 from Weston and Archie. He talks about Jean Parks and says that she's, quote, one of the most beautiful women in Harlem, end quote. He's saved by a cop from Paisano. So these Italians that were, he sounds like they were coming to rob him. Then when he gets back to his apartment, Sammy tells him that West Indian Archie is looking for him. He felt like he was being protected by Allah. Well, Malcolm felt like he was being protected by Allah. No, Allah, sorry. He says, quote, they say God takes care of fools and babies. I've so often thought that Allah was watching over me, end quote. He says this time in his life, he was mentally dead, and he was doing cocaine to kill time. And that's the end of chapter 7. Make sure you share this information if you like what you heard. Visit malcolmxfoundation.org if you'd like to make a donation. Let me know if there's anything you disagree with. And other than that, I will see y'all in chapter 8. Thank you.